Good evening, guys. So, I hope you guys liked last night's story. Tonight's story, we're still going to be going on to with Lyle the crocodile. In tonight's story, will be Lyle Crocodile by Bernard Waber for Mary Kay. This is the house on East 88th Street. Mr. and Mrs. Prim and their son, Joshua, live in the house on East 88th Street. So does Lyle. Listen. Swish, swash, splash, sploosh. That's Lyle. Lyle the crocodile. Lyle was very happy living with the Prim family. He was especially happy when he was being useful, like helping Joshua brush up on schoolwork. But if Lyle was happy, he was making someone else unhappy. Perfectly miserable, in fact. That someone else was Loretta, Mr. Grump's cat. Mr. Grumps lives just 2 houses away from the Prims. Whenever his cat got even the slightest glimpse of Lyle, she would fling herself into a nervous fit. Lyle wanted desperately to win Loretta over. He tried flashing his sweetest, most toothsome smile to show her how really friendly he was, but this only frightened the distrustful animal even more. In the end, Mr. Grumps, who was even more excitable than his cat, would burst from the house, shaking an angry fist at Lyle. "Something has to be done about that crocodile," he shouted as Lyle fled to safety of his own house. To take his mind off his troubles with Loretta and Mr. Grumps, Lyle filled his days playing with Joshua and his friends. He loved being it. He could play double dutch 100 times without missing. It came as no particular surprise that Lyle could high jump, but Loretta, who was just out for airing, was surprised. Terribly surprised. Oh, that poor cat. Loretta was so surprised and so shaken she fled to the nearest tree. And no amount of coaxing would bring her down, not until Mr. Grumps arrived to rescue and comfort her. Would she consider coming down? "Something has to be done about that crocodile," stormed Mr. Grumps. Now, Mr. Grumps was really furious. Now he knew he would be snappy, irritable, and impossible to live with when he returned to his job in the big department store the following day. The next several days, Mrs. Prim thought it best to keep Lyle close at her side. Together they fussed around the kitchen, preparing good things for the family to eat. When the weather permitted, they took lunch in the park. Lyle was always one for sharing. And they even took trips downtown. There was so much to see in the big city, and there was so much to do. Mrs. Prim could spend hours just browsing around antique shops. Lyle could spend hours watching building construction. They both loved to ice skate. One day, Mrs. Prim and Lyle went shopping in a big department store. Unfortunately for everyone, it turned out to be the very same store in which Mr. Grumps held an important position. And unfortunately, they were to hear from Mr. Grumps all too soon, for it was his voice that suddenly broke in over the loudspeaker to announce a sale in the pajama department. Immediately, as if everyone in the store was desperate in need of pajamas, separated from Mrs. Prim, Lyle was swept along with the crowd. As they neared the pajama department, Lyle thought he heard a familiar voice. "Lyle," the voice called out. Lyle recognized that voice all right. And the face as well. The voice and the face belonged to Hector P. Valente, star of stage and screen. But what was Signor Valente up to now? Well, for the moment, it seemed, he was busy selling pajamas. Lyle remembered unhappily his days of traveling and performing with Sergei Valente, but in spite of everything, the two were delighted to see each other once more. In another part of the store, Mrs. Prim searched frantically for Kyle. "Excuse me," she said, the lady at the information booth. "Have you seen a crocodile going past? He was wearing a red scarf." "No," answered the lady. "I have no information about a crocodile wearing a red scarf." "Excuse me," said Mrs. Prim to the sporting goods salesman. "Have you by chance come across a crocodile? His name is Lyle." "Sorry, madam," answered the salesman. "I have not come across any crocodile named Lyle today." Mrs. Prim grew more and more upset. "Excuse me," she said to a man wearing a white carnation. "I've lost my crocodile and I don't know what to do." Whatever the man answered, Mrs. Prim never heard it, for his voice was lost in a chorus of other voices shouting, "More! More!" Those voices belonged to the huge crowd of shoppers surrounding Hector P. Valente, Edka, and Lyle. Because they had an audience and because Sigmar Valente could not resist showing off, he had persuaded Lyle to help him in a free performance of their old stage act. "More! More!" the surprised but delighted shoppers called out, forgetting all about wanting or even needing pajamas. Mrs. Prim caught up with them just in time to hear another voice charge with fury shout, "What is going on here?" This was Mr. Grumps, and when Mr. Grumps saw what was really going on, his face turned red, blue, and purple with rage. "Madam," he gasped, "we do not permit crocodiles in the store, you know. Remove him at once." "And you, sir," he said, pointing a dagger-like finger at Signor Valente, "you, sir, are dismissed." "Something will have to be done about that crocodile." Those warning words of Mr. Grumps still rang in the ears as they said goodbye to Signor Valente outside the store. Mr. Grumps made his threat to do something about that crocodile. The next day he appeared at the Prim's door with papers authorizing Lyle to be committed to the city zoo. "The zoo!" Mrs. Prim exclaimed miserably. "Whatever will Lyle be doing in the zoo? He'll be doing whatever it is normal crocodiles are supposed to be doing," snapped Mr. Grumps, who wasn't at all nice about it. The Prims examined the papers. They appeared to be in order. There was little they could do, for at least in the moment, to prevent Mr. Grumps from putting Lyle in the zoo. Lyle's first night was difficult indeed. Not wanting to seem unsociable, he decided to join the other crocodiles, but they were cozily piled together. Just when he thought he'd gotten himself comfortable on top, he awakened to find himself crushed on the very bottom. Lyle's restlessness so annoyed the other crocodiles they just got up and stomped off in a huff. Lyle was happier during the day when visitors came. He amused everyone with his unusual tricks, and before long he was the biggest attraction at the zoo. Joshua and Mrs. Prim visited regularly, arms laden with games, toys, and Turkish caviar Lyle so loved. Mrs. Prim did her best to smile and appear cheerful, but she couldn't hide her concern. "Are you feeling all right, dear?" she would ask. "Are you getting enough rest? Are you making friends with the other crocodiles? Do the lions keep you awake at night? Is the floor too damp? Do the flies pester you?" Lyle shook his head, yes or no, depending on the question. He tried putting on a brave front, but Mrs. Prim knew he was well unhappy and fought back her tears. One night, a new keeper arrived at Lyle's cage. Surprise, surprise! The new keeper turned out to be none other than Hector P. Valente, the star of the stage and screen. "Shh!" whispered Signor Valente. I have come to rescue you." Signor Valente unlocked the door of the cage and the astonished Lyle was set free. It appears that Valente has a lot of accents that he's trying to do. "You can't go home again," said Signor Valente when they put in the zoo. Signor Valente was bursting with ideas. "We'll put on an old act together," he said. "We'll fly to Australia. They'll love us in Australia." Lyle groaned. The very thought of never seeing the house on East 88th Street again was grim indeed, and too much for him to endure. Signor Valente read his thoughts and decided Lyle should have one last look at the house on East 88th Street. Approaching the now sleeping street, they suddenly met with a wall of dense smoke, and the smoke, they realized with horror, was coming from Mr. Grump's house. While Signor Valente ran to signal the alarm, Lyle broke into the house and rescued all the sleeping occupants. A gasping, frightened Mr. Grumps and his cat were led safely off the street. Now the parents of the entire neighborhood were waiting to witness Lyle's heroism. Mr. Grumps couldn't think enough. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Mr. Grumps to the crowd of onlookers, "Lyle is the bravest, kindest, most wonderful crocodile in the whole wide world. I would consider it a privilege and a pleasure to have him as our neighbor once more." "Hooray!" shouted the Prims. "Hooray!" shouted the crowd. Lyle moved back into the house on East 88th Street that very night. Several days later, a farewell party was given by the Prims for Signor Valente, who was leaving to seek fortune and adventure in Australia. "Remember," said Mr. Grumps, speaking to Signor Valente, "should you ever change your mind about leaving, a job in my store will always be yours just for the asking. We need people with your kind of talent and ability." Everyone smiled happily. Even Loretta. The end. I hope you enjoyed that story. It seems that they had the worst impression of Lyle before actually getting to know him. So it's always probably a good thing to not really judge a book by its cover. It could look like a crocodile, but it could be Lyle. All right. I love you guys. Bye-bye.